Good morning, everybody. Another glorious fall morning. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak with you once again today. The title of this talk is Dogen, the True Self. As you know, the last few Dharma talks I've been doing is focusing on works of Dogen and sitting with them and not just reading them. And in that, I've noticed a lot of similarities, and you'll see similarities, you'll see tie-ins with last week's Dharma talk, you'll see tie-ins with Uji, the two previous talks. So the topic is important. Well, last week we emphasized Dogen's teaching about our thoughts and ideas we might have about Zen, realization, practice, etc. We must not be attached to those thoughts about enlightenment, or for that matter, Zen practice. Certainly not correcting, judging, or evaluating ourselves or other people. Yet, we must somehow express our understanding, not impeded by thoughts of, well, that's shallow, or that's, oh wow, heavy, man, deep. Correct versus wrong. And talking about the Dharma isn't shallow. Doesn't mean it's a shallow understanding. Now today we're going to look at how Dogen offers another lens into Buddha Dharma, into our true nature, and pushes us to examine the ideas we have about ourself. What is ourself? And points to our true self. Now once again, the first reading is from Yuibutsu Yobutsu, only a Buddha and a Buddha. And again, that was written somewhere between 1231 and 1239 Common Era. So then in section 3, Dogen relates an old story and clearly indicates something can be said about the true self. He said, a teacher of old said, although the entire universe is nothing but the Dharma body of the self, you should not be hindered by the Dharma body. In other words, not being hindered means attaching concepts or developing some idea about it. And he says, if you are hindered by the Dharma body, you will not be able to turn freely no matter how hard you try. But there should be a way to be free from hindrance. What then is the way for all people to be free from hindrance? And then he says critically, if you cannot say clearly how to free all people, you will lose even the life of the Dharma body and sink into the ocean of suffering for a long time. A little over dramatic. But he's saying you should say something. You should speak up. And then Dogen, as he often does, asks a question. He says, if you are asked in this way, how can you answer so as to keep the Dharma body alive and avoid sinking into that ocean of suffering? And then, as Dogen often does, he answers his own question. And he says, if you're asked in this way, how can you answer? He says, if you're asked, how can you answer that? By to keep your body alive and avoiding the suffering. He says, in that case, say, the entire universe is the Dharma body of the self. When you say the entire universe is the Dharma body of the self, words cannot express it. In other words, it can't express the totality. But he says that's the truth. And then he continues it. When words cannot express fully, should we understand there is nothing to be said? Without words, ancient Buddhas said something. And of course, his Shobogenzo collection, of which I'm reading a portion from, is a huge volume of work. So people said some stuff, right? So, of course, words can't capture the totality of what we mean by the Dharma body is the self, or the universe is a self, or anything else like that. But words aren't necessarily a shallow understanding. They can point toward something that's profound. Now in section 4, he amplifies this theme, and he quotes another ancient Buddha First line is, the entire universe is the true human body. The entire universe is the gate of liberation. The entire universe is the eye of Vairochana. The entire universe is the Dharma body of the self. Now, Vairochana is the cosmic Buddha, not the Nirmanakaya or the physical Buddha. And he then goes on to comment about these 4 lines. So the first line, the true human body means your own true body. Know that the entire universe is your own true body, which is not this temporary body. Our body-mind apparatuses, if you will. I think I called that last week. If someone asks you, why don't we usually notice this? He says, just reflect within yourself that the entire universe is the true human body. So he's doing what we can only do, and that's to invite people to look in. Our words can't do the work for them. But he turns that back. He says, or you could say the entire universe is the true human body. Already you know this. If you accept your inherent Buddha nature, of course. So again, he's constantly turning it back, inviting you, to look inside and see if that's not so. Again, like we said last week, not according to any set concepts you have about it. Then in the second line, which is the entire universe is the gate of liberation, he says that means that you're not at all entangled or captivated, in other words, by the concepts, by the words. What is called the entire universe is undivided from the moment, the ages, mind, and words. Oh my gosh, isn't that wonderful? Undivided from the moment, the ages, the kalpas, in other words, the mind and words. This limitless and boundless experience is the entire universe. So he's pointing towards something. Again, he can't get you there, but he's pointing towards something. He continues then. Oh, and we'll see this echoed in another famous work, which I'll quote later. He says, even if you seek to enter or go through this gate of liberation, he says, it can't be done. How is this so? And then he says, reflect on the question raised. If you intend to seek outside of what is, nothing will be attained. Nothing will be attained. So it's beyond our dualistic views, obviously, our perception, beyond our thoughts. Seeking and trying already misses the enlightened nature. You'll never find it. In the words of Smash Mouth, you might as well be walking on the sun, right? It's not going to happen. The third line, he says the entire universe is the eye of Vairochana, which means the Buddhas have a single eye. And he says, don't suppose that Buddha's eyes are like the human eyes. In other words, are an ordinary perception. Humans have 2 eyes, but when you say a human eye, you don't say 2 eyes or 3 eyes. Those who study the teaching should not understand that the eye of the Buddha, the eye of Dharma, or the celestial eye is like our 2 eyes. To believe that it is like human eyes is lamentable. So he says he's really making a contrast between unattached perception and our usual attachment perception, our usual dualistic views. So it has nothing to do with our dualistic vision or any other sense perception. And it's beyond thought and perceptions. Then in the fourth line, he says, also learn that the entire universe is the Dharma body of the self. To seek to know the self is invariably the wish of human beings. However, those who see the true self are rare. Only Buddhas know the true self. People outside the way regard what is not the self, the small self, as the self, the true self. But what Buddhists call the self is the entire universe. Therefore, there is never an entire universe that is not the self with or without your knowing it. I'll read that again. There is never an entire universe that is not the self, with or without our knowing about it. And that's, of course, back to Dogen's fundamental question, which, doggone it, if we have Buddha nature, why do we have to practice? Well, because we don't see it yet. It's there, we just don't see it. So, on that, and then he says, on that matter, defer to the words of the ancient Buddhas. In other words, have faith you're a Buddha, that your true self is the entire universe. Now, when you read Dogen, you'll find you start reading something and you think, wait a minute, I've read that before. I've read that somewhere else in his writings. So now I'm going to turn to the much more famous Ginjo Koan. And it gives a slightly different expression to the same reality he's pointing to. Ginjo Koan, or actualizing the fundamental point, is the first fascicle, usually, the first installment in the Shogo Genzo collection of his work. And that was written in 1233, but it was revised in 1252, the year right before he died. So I think just that maybe is significant. He went back after all his career of clarifying and seeing more aspects of reality, he went back. So, and this is probably the most common of all of the installments that is written about and commented about. It's pretty common. So section 2 directly points to the reality in the previous section of Yuibutsu Yobutsu. He says, to carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. In other words, to carry us, our small body mind, like we're scientists examining stuff, judging things. He says, that's delusion. That myriad things come forth and illuminate the self is awakening. Now, you got to be careful, because somebody hearing that go, okay, I just have to realize that everything illuminates, and then you're back to the small self. No, no, no. Nope. No, it's the entire universe. So it is illuminating everything. That's the true self. And then in section 2, my favorite 2 lines are, those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. It's kind of almost surprising, isn't it? What? Great realization of delusion. And then he says, those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. In other words, ordinary people. Why? Well, because they have these ideas in their head about what illumination is. Further, there are those who continue going, who continue realizing beyond realization. In other words, beyond any concept of that they're doing it. But then there are those who are in delusion throughout delusion. They just are always stuck on their ideas about realization. And I think people are nodding. It's a tie-in with last week, right? About having these ideas. Being stuck in ideas, picking and choosing, looking for hints. So there are many aspects to delusion. I mean, there's ideas and thoughts, believing them, attaching to them. There's dualistic or relativistic perception, which kind of leaves out a lot, but we still believe it's what we see, right? Seeing the small body mind as the true self would be delusion. But also, you could experience delusion as illuminated by the entire universe too, which is goes right back to Uji and 3 and 4 talks ago. He says, when Buddhas are truly Buddhas, they do not necessarily notice they're Buddhas. They don't attach to it. It's kind of ordinary. However, they are actualized Buddha who go on actualizing Buddha. So I think this shows a lot of similarity to what we talked about last week. That they're, you know, when you're not attached to ideas, when you've let go of your expectations of realization. That's really what he's pointing to. And you see it over and over and over in his writings. Then in section 3, he switches to ordinary perceptions. He says, when you see forms or hear sounds, fully engaging body and mind, you intuit Dharma intimately. If it's a non-dual perception, of course. And then he gives a nice metaphor for that, our limited perception. He says, unlike things and the reflections in a mirror, and unlike the moon and its reflection in water, where one side's illuminated, but the other side's dark. See, that's our limited perception, isn't it? It's a nice metaphor of how what we think and we're seeing is really one-sided and limited. And then section 4, which is a very famous and widely quoted section, also I think conforms with the previous section in Yui Butsu about the self as the whole universe. But when you read Dogen, you have to be very careful about which self he's referring to. So to study the way of enlightenment is to study the self. But just what is the self? Is it what you feel in your body and mind? How big is that self? Is it just this little package? So you have to be careful. And then he says to study the self is to forget the self. Now that is the small self, right? To study the true self, in other words. And then he says to forget the small self is to be actualized by myriad things, countless, everything, in other words. When actualized by myriad things, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of everybody else, drops away. No trace of enlightenment remains. And this no trace continues endlessly. In other words, you drop all the ideas out. Because they had nothing to do with realization after all, right? When you first seek Dharma, which is a dualistic view, you imagine you are far away from its environs. At the moment when Dharma is authentically transmitted, you are immediately your original self, because it's already there. And of course that aligns with our talk last week, that again, what we think about realization has nothing to do with realization. It's not going to help us get there. Finally, in section 5, Dogen provides another interesting metaphor about impermanence, I guess you'd say. He says, when you ride in a boat and watch the shore, you might assume the shore is moving. I'm here, everything around me is changing, right? That's our usual mode I'm driving right, as everybody else is a crazy driver, right? Although my drive was wonderful. Anyhow, he says, but when you keep your eyes closely on the boat, you see that the boat moves. Similarly, if you examine myriad things with a confused mind, you might suppose your mind and essence are permanent. I'm watching the whole universe change, right? When you practice intimately and return to where you are, it will be clear that nothing at all has an unchanging self. Now it doesn't split the observation. He says, you will not notice that everything has, right? And this is kind of phrased in the negative. So phrasing in the affirmative, he's saying everything, and there's no me or other. Everything has a changing nature. But the way he phrases it leaves out the small self and the rest of the universe, right? Because in other words, that distinction won't be there. That separation will drop away. And the line, if you examine myriad things with a confused body and mind, means the same thing as the first line from section 2, to carry the self forward and illuminate myriad things is delusion. In other words, dualistic analysis, judging, that type of thing. Now those are the two selections, and I hope you've kind of heard some similarities from my previous talks. But this is a Dharma talk. We're using words. Remember, words aren't necessarily bad. Thoughts aren't necessarily bad. They're just coming up. But you still want to entertain some thoughts. You might consider these. What if you extends beyond the confines of your body? What if your mind is not just generated from the interior of your skull, but extends to the far reaches of the universe? What about thoughts? What remains when a thought is gone? What's there? What's your experience? Or here's a little stronger way of putting it. What remains unstained by your worst thoughts or perceptions? That's a thought for you to entertain, isn't it? And going back a little further, what if Uji, being time is right? Everything exists in this moment. Remember, I didn't say you and the universe. Everything exists in this moment by the illumination of time, and that changes every moment, lasting for no time at all. And this was on my bench at home. Just popped into my head. What if I'm not creating this conscious experience, but all things co-create, meaning this experience? So there's nothing wrong with thoughts. Thoughts and words can point. Questions can point. To summarize today's talks, or today's talk, our true self is not just our body-mind. It's not our thoughts. It's not our sense perceptions. We need to drop the need to search for or get enlightenment. Because there's no need. There's nothing to search for. And as Dogen invites, take the backward step and let the small body-mind drop away. You know, from my long past, Mayazumi Roshi said, and I'll paraphrase it, he says, have absolute faith you are a Buddha. As you sit as the Buddha. That was from a retreat, and he was talking about Shikantaza. But I'd say, have absolute faith in the true self and the whole universe.